What would you do if you overheard two little boys behind you whispering they couldn't afford lunch, and you realized they were in your restaurant? One CEO, dressed like any other customer, froze in place, and what he discovered next would shake the foundation of his company. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us and inspires us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. The lunchtime rush at the Golden Spoon Diner on Maple Avenue was in full swing. Plates clattered in the kitchen, a blender whirred behind the counter, and conversations overlapped like waves on the shore. The line at the register curled toward the door, and the air carried a faint mix of grease, syrup, and something too clean to be comforting, maybe lemon disinfectant. Ethan Marlowe stood somewhere in the middle of the line, hands in the pockets of a navy windbreaker, posture casual, gaze drifting. To most around him, he looked like any other man stopping in for lunch. No tie, no briefcase, just a middle-aged guy with graying hair and scuffed loafers. But behind that calm presence was the CEO of the entire Golden Spoon franchise. A man who once flipped pancakes at a roadside diner to pay rent before building one of the largest casual dining chains in the country. He had no entourage, no name badge. That was his style. Ethan preferred to drop into his restaurants without notice. He believed the truth about a business never sat in the polished reports. It hid in the creases, in the unnoticed, in the silence between customers and staff. Two boys stood just behind him. One of them was maybe 8 or 9. The other looked a little older. Their clothes were worn but clean, jackets zipped up to their necks like armor. Ethan wasn't really listening at first, but something in the younger one's voice made his ear lean slightly their way. "I've got $3, the boy whispered. "Can I get something with that?" "Careful," the older one murmured. "Last time, she got mad when I asked for half a pancake." Ethan didn't turn, but his back stiffened. At the counter, Alexa, the cashier, barely looked at them. Her nails tapped against the register as she scanned a man's order ahead. The corners of her mouth flattened. She glanced over the kids like they were another problem she didn't have time for. Then she looked away. Next, no smile, no welcome, just cold routine. Ethan's jaw shifted slightly, and a memory crept in, himself at 11, standing outside a corner bakery in Detroit, counting coins in his palm and realizing he was 32 cents short. The woman behind that counter hadn't even spoken, just pointed at the sign and shook her head. He'd walked away hungry, cheeks burning. A tray clattered behind the kitchen window. Marco, one of the newer line cooks, looked up just long enough to notice the kids. His eyes softened, lingered, then dropped back to the sizzling griddle in front of him. His shoulders said it all. He wanted to do something, but he didn't. No one did. Ethan moved forward in line, but his mind stayed behind. When it was his turn, he ordered something small, just eggs and toast. Black coffee. Alexa never looked him in the eye. She mumbled the total, handed him the receipt, and turned to the next customer before he'd stepped aside. He walked to a window seat near the back and sat down slowly. He didn't eat right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and opened a notepad app. Quietly, he typed, "Branch number 27 Maple Avenue noon." Two boys turned away. "Staff behavior cold, Alexa." He paused, looked up. The boys were gone. He hadn't seen them leave. Something in his chest tightened. Not from anger, but from a sense of recognition. He had built this company so no child would have to feel the way he once did. And yet here he was, watching it happen under his nose. Ethan sipped his coffee, though it had already gone cold. He didn't confront anyone. Not yet. There were patterns to study, silences to track. This wasn't the first time he'd seen something off, but it was the first time it had felt this personal. He looked out the window, watching the street, the people walking by. Then he looked back at the counter, where Alexa was now laughing with another customer, someone well-dressed. Someone who clearly fit whatever standard she'd built in her mind. Ethan's eyes didn't narrow. He didn't scowl, but a decision settled in his bones. Quiet, firm, and certain. He finished his toast in silence, left a tip on the table, and walked out without a word. Ethan didn't go home after leaving the diner. He drove straight to the headquarters. weaving through early afternoon traffic with the windows cracked open just enough to let the cold air remind him he was still thinking. The city moved on outside, unaware of what had stirred something old and unresolved in him. By the time he pulled into the underground garage, his mind had settled into that particular stillness it always found before a storm. Within the hour, he was in the operations wing, standing in the small, quiet control room that housed the internal audit team. The hum of servers and faint clacking of keyboards filled the space. He called for a closed-door meeting, and only one person walked in without hesitation, Lisa Park, head of internal investigations. She was precise, calm, and the kind of person who knew where the real stories were buried. Not just where the numbers looked good on paper. Ethan didn't waste time. "I want the surveillance footage from Maple Avenue," he said, standing with his hands on the back of a chair. "The noon rush. Just play it through. No edits." Lisa raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. She typed a few commands, pulled up the feed, and turned the monitor toward him. They watched in silence as the video played out. Ethan saw himself in line. Then the two boys stepping up timidly, glancing at the overhead menu. Alexa never greeted them, never asked their names. She tapped the register impatiently when they hesitated, then shifted to the next customer without a word. From that angle, the whole thing felt colder, clinical, the kind of cold you didn't need to explain, you just felt it deep in your gut. Lisa leaned forward, watching closely. "You're not imagining it." She didn't even acknowledge them. "Go back 10 minutes, Ethan said. "Let's see how she treats the guy before them. The one in the suit." They rewound. There it was. Alexa smiled, made small talk, even offered him an extra hash brown on the house. It wasn't just inconsistent, it was a pattern. When the footage ended, Ethan turned toward Lisa. "I need more than this." She hesitated. "Sir, that kind of behavior, it's not isolated." Ethan's jaw shifted. "What do you mean?" Lisa opened a folder on her tablet and pulled up a series of flagged internal reports. There have been customer complaints across multiple locations, very similar tone. Ignored patrons, refused service to those who didn't meet some unspoken standard. The trend isn't regional, but, she paused, tapping to another screen. "When I pulled the full quarterly reports, most of those incidents weren't in the summaries sent to you." Ethan frowned. "You're saying someone scrubbed them?" "Not scrubbed, filtered." The complaint logs were submitted, but they were marked as resolved or customer misunderstanding before reaching corporate view. She showed him a spreadsheet with columns of approvals. One name kept appearing under final clearance, Carter Voss. Ethan leaned back. The name wasn't unfamiliar. Carter had been with the company a long time, director of Eastern Operations. Smooth in meetings, always armed with data, but Ethan had never looked too closely at how Carter maintained such immaculate numbers in his territory. Lisa looked uneasy. "He's known for managing problems quietly. People who speak up tend to get shuffled around or leave. There were 3 managers last year from the Eastern region who requested internal audits. And none of those requests made it through. They all left within 2 months." Ethan's voice dropped. "Send me the full list of complaints from the last 3 months. I want all raw entries. No summaries." Lisa nodded, but her eyes flicked toward the door. "Sir, I have to say this. If you go after Carter, you might be stepping into something bigger than you expect." "I'm not going after him," Ethan said quietly. "I'm going after what's rotting under our name." They left it there, for now. Later that evening, after most of the staff had gone home, Ethan returned to his office on the 10th floor. The city lights blinked below like a restless sea. His desk was usually clean. But tonight, something sat squarely in the center, a white envelope with no markings. He hadn't seen it earlier. He picked it up, turned it over. No name, no return address. Inside, a single piece of paper. "If you really want to understand what's happening, go to Warehouse 4. After 9 p.m. don't go alone. They're everywhere." His hand stilled on the page. He glanced toward the security monitor on his wall. The feed from the building's cameras had a gap, exactly 2 minutes of black screen. Whoever left the note had known what they were doing. Ethan folded the paper carefully, placed it in a drawer, and locked it. Then he picked up his phone and stared at it for a long moment before typing out a message to Lisa. "Need you with me tonight. Warehouse 4, 9 sharp. Come light." But come ready. He didn't hit send right away. His reflection in the darkened glass behind the monitor looked older tonight. Not tired, but bracing for something he couldn't yet name. Then he hit send. The sky had turned the color of worn denim by the time Ethan pulled off the side road and eased his car to a quiet stop. Warehouse number 4 stood just past the edge of the company's old logistics compound, tucked behind a chain-link fence and half swallowed by overgrown hedges. No lights, no cameras, no movement. It looked like it hadn't seen real use in years, which was probably the point. He stepped out and adjusted the collar of his coat against the chill. A second vehicle rolled in moments later. It was Marco, the young man from the diner, the only one who'd seemed bothered by the way those two boys had been treated. Ethan hadn't told him much, just said, "I need someone I can trust. You coming?" Marco hadn't hesitated. Now, under the flickering light of a nearby lamppost, the younger man joined him silently. "You sure about this?" Ethan asked. "I was sure when I saw her ignore those kids. I didn't know what to do then. But I do now," Marco said quietly. They walked to the door. It creaked open before they knocked. Inside, the warehouse was dim and smelled of dust, metal, and something faintly medicinal. A single bulb swung overhead near the far end, casting long shadows across rows of unused equipment. A figure stepped out from behind a storage rack. She wore a hooded sweatshirt and kept her hair tucked under a cap. Her voice was calm but direct. "You came alone?" "No," Ethan replied. "This is Marco. He's with me." She lowered the hood. Jenny Tran. She didn't need introduction. Ethan remembered her. Former regional quality supervisor. Always thorough. A stickler for ethical standards. Disappeared from the system 3 months ago. No explanation had ever made it to his desk. "I left that note," she said. "I didn't know if you'd come. Most people in your position would have ignored it." "I almost did," Ethan admitted. "But then I saw what I wasn't supposed to." Jenny gestured them toward a folding table set up near the back wall. On it were 2 laptops, a tangle of wires, and an old external hard drive. "I've been collecting this since the week they pushed me out," she said. "Emails, meeting transcripts, screenshots." Carter didn't put things in writing often, but his people did, enough to see the pattern. Marco looked at the hard drive. "Why haven't you gone to the media?" Jenny smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You think a news outlet's going to care about a corporate culture issue buried under legal jargon and HR language? They'll call it miscommunication and sweep it. Besides, Carter has friends in a lot of places. That's why I needed someone inside." Ethan crossed his arms. "Tell me everything." She took a breath. "The core of it?" Carter gave unofficial directives to every Eastern regional manager. Certain customers, if they looked like they couldn't pay full price, if they seemed homeless, if they were just not what he called brand aligned, we weren't supposed to serve them. Or at least, make it uncomfortable enough they wouldn't come back. Ethan's stomach turned. Jenny continued. "Every proposal I submitted for low-income meal programs or community outreach initiatives got flagged for review. Then they disappeared. Weeks later, I'd be told they didn't meet our financial benchmarks. But I'd check the logs. Someone was manually removing them. Always under Carter's admin key." Ethan leaned on the table. "And when you called it out?" "I was told I was too emotionally invested. That I needed a break. Next thing I knew, my access was cut, and I was escorted out with a severance packet I didn't even sign." She slid the hard drive toward him. "That's everything I copied before they wiped my terminal. It's all time-stamped." Ethan stared at it for a long moment. Then he turned to Marco. "You don't have to be part of this," he said. Marco shook his head. "Actually, I do." There was something in his voice, firm, clear, not the nervous tone from the diner. "I wasn't just some kid off the street," Marco said. "I was a business school intern. Got placed here through the foundation scholarship your name's on. I took the job to see how this company runs from the inside. I wanted to believe in it. Still do." Ethan felt the words land in a way that surprised even him. "So you've been watching," Ethan said. "I've been learning, and now I want to help fix it." Ethan looked at both of them. A former supervisor discarded for her principles. A young man who'd hidden in plain sight, quietly assessing the system. And himself, tired, but not done. They weren't many, but they were enough to start. "We go quiet from here on out," he said. No emails. No paper trails. This stays between us and Lisa for now. Jenny nodded. Marco gave a quiet, steady look of agreement. We don't take Carter head on yet. Ethan added. We build our case. We map the rot. Then we cut it out. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose siding of the warehouse. Ethan tucked the hard drive inside his coat. The night no longer felt quiet. It felt like the start of something long overdue. Lisa sat alone in the dim corner of the data compliance office, her laptop casting a pale blue glow on her face as the rest of the building slipped into nighttime silence. She hadn't left the headquarters since the meeting with Ethan and Marco. Something about that warehouse, about Jenny's calm intensity, had shaken her more than she let on. She knew something was wrong. She had known for a while, but now the pieces were finally lining up. She'd been combing through 6 months of turnover reports. On the surface, everything looked within range, occasional spikes, some seasonal shifts. But when she filtered by Carter Voss's Eastern Division, a different story emerged. Several locations had lost their frontline staff in waves. It wasn't the turnover itself, it was who was leaving. Names she recognized, people who had once been praised in quarterly reviews for their empathy, their ability to handle difficult customers with grace. Quietly, one by one, they had disappeared from the system. She leaned back, letting the patterns settle in her mind. Every time someone showed too much compassion, too much humanity, they didn't last. Not under Carter. She clicked over to the encrypted folder Jenny had left on the duplicate drive. One file stood out, a voice recording marked only by a date and time stamp. Lisa slipped on her headphones and pressed play. The audio crackled, then came into focus, Carter's voice, unmistakable in its cold precision. We're running a business, not a charity. We don't need people who think serving soup to the homeless is part of the brand. We need people who hit targets. If they can't handle that, cut them loose. A brief pause, the sound of someone nervously clearing their throat. I know some of you are concerned about the optics. Carter continued. So here's the fix. Rewrite the incident logs. We make the customer the problem, not the employee. Frustrated customer? Miscommunication. Underserved area? Staffing shortage. Get ahead of it on the record. And no one looks deeper. Lisa stopped the recording. That wasn't policy bending. That was deliberate deception. Corporate sabotage with a polite tie and a smile. She closed the file and opened another list, potential allies. Ex-employees who might testify if this ever made it into a board review or ethics hearing. One name jumped out, Leo Dunn. He had managed one of the largest and most diverse Golden Spoon locations in the Northeast. Known for his community outreach programs, he was respected by his staff and popular with customers. Until, suddenly, he wasn't. He'd left a year ago under a vague mutual agreement. Last she heard, he was managing a small diner in upstate New York. Lisa picked up the phone. The conversation wasn't easy. Leo had moved on. Or tried to. But when she played a small clip of the recording, he went quiet. I always knew something was wrong, he said. I just couldn't prove it. Now we can, Lisa replied. After she hung up, she called Ethan. He was already in his office, pacing, voice low and tight. Carter's going national, he said before she could speak. What? Board's voting in 2 weeks. Promotion to Vice President of National Operations. If it goes through, he'll have full say in every region, every hiring policy, every training guideline. Lisa sat in silence. If we don't stop him before that vote, Ethan continued, everything we're doing might not matter. Before she could respond, his voice dropped. Jenny's gone. Lisa straightened. Gone where? I don't know. Her apartment was open. No signs of a struggle. But her laptop's wiped. Her backup drive's missing. Lisa felt a chill run down her spine. You think Carter? I don't know what I think, Ethan said, but I made a copy. I didn't tell anyone where it is. Not even you. There was a long pause between them. Ethan added, we have to assume everything we say, everything we type, is being monitored. We need to move quietly. We're not just up against company policy anymore. We're up against people willing to erase whatever threatens their grip. That night, Ethan took a calculated risk. He created a clean audio file, just a short clip of Carter's voice. The part about rewriting records. He sent it through a secure, anonymous channel to the chairman of the board. marked only with the subject, internal culture concern. No name, no explanation, just a test. The next morning, he received an email from the chairman's personal secretary. Short, formal, but layered. Mr. Marlowe, I believe there are things you haven't told us yet. If you are in opposition to Mr. Voss, be cautious. He's not just an executive. He's something else entirely. Ethan stared at the message for a long while, his coffee untouched beside him. He had always known the corporate world had sharp edges, but now it felt like he was walking through a maze lined with broken glass. Ethan sat alone in the back of the boardroom, hands folded loosely, eyes steady on the long table polished to a quiet gleam. The invitation had come that morning, marked confidential, and scheduled for an off-the-calendar session with only the highest-ranking executives in attendance. No agenda, no minutes recorded, just a quiet directive. Be there. The room filled slowly. Familiar faces entered without small talk, directors, region heads, legal counsel, and Carter Voss. Carter moved through the room like someone who already owned the floor. Sharp charcoal suit, nothing out of place, and a calm, controlled smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. When he took the seat 2 spots down from Ethan, he didn't look his way. The chairwoman, Marianne Royce, called the meeting to order with a voice as smooth as stone. Today's discussion concerns strategic elevation and the nomination of Carter Voss as Executive Vice President of National Operations. There was a ripple of polite applause. Carter nodded graciously, then launched into his presentation without waiting for ceremony. His slides came fast, metrics, forecasts, graphs climbing steeply like mountains of logic. He spoke about efficiency, performance benchmarks, the importance of streamlined systems. Words like standardization, realignment, and cost neutralization tumbled out in neat, sanitized phrases. When he spoke of eliminating peripheral expenditures, Ethan knew what he meant. Community programs, discounted meals, anything that didn't convert to immediate gain. At one point, Carter paused, smiled slightly, and said, "We must focus on what sustains growth. Nostalgia and sentimentality are luxuries. A business survives by knowing where to trim." No one challenged him, not yet. Then Chairwoman Royce looked toward Ethan. "Mr. Marlowe, you've been quiet." Ethan leaned forward, voice even but clear. "I just have one question. Are we building a brand for the investors, or for the people who need us most?" There was a beat of silence. Carter turned toward him slowly, the smile still there but now edged with something else. "Our responsibility," Carter said, "is to deliver value. Emotion doesn't build margins, systems do. Weakness, masked as kindness, becomes inefficiency, and inefficiency is how companies die." A few heads nodded around the table. Others looked down at their notes. Ethan said nothing more. He didn't need to. After the meeting, as people filtered out in murmurs, Marianne Royce caught up with him in the hallway. Her heels tapped softly against the tile as she slowed beside him. "I've heard things," she said quietly, "but whispers and feelings don't shape policy." Ethan kept walking. "If you have something," she added, "show it, not in corners, not in locked offices. Truth only matters if people can see it." That night, Ethan met Leo Dunn at a diner just off a rural exit. One of those places where the coffee pot never left the burner and every booth had a story stained into the leather. Leo looked older than his years, exhausted but clear-eyed. "He came after me," Leo said, "right after I pushed back on one of his regional memos. He told us to categorize customers based on their spend likelihood. No formal policy, of course. Just suggestion." Leo passed across a weathered manila envelope. Inside were printouts, screenshots, and a USB stick. Regional memos, quietly phrased but unmistakably structured around exclusion, targeting people with visible disabilities. Discounted meal patterns, even zip codes associated with shelters or subsidized housing. "I saved what I could," Leo said, "didn't know what to do with it, until now." Before Ethan could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from Marco. "HR just pulled me in. Said someone reported me for leaking documents. I didn't say a word. I swear." Ethan's pulse tightened. Carter was closing in, watching, testing the perimeter. That night, back at his office, Ethan gathered Lisa, Marco, and Leo. He spread the evidence out on the table, then carefully divided it. "You each keep a piece," he said. "No one has the full picture alone. If one of us is compromised, the others can still act." They sat in tense silence as he outlined the plan. Not a backroom fight. Not another silent war behind closed doors. This time, they would take it public. "We'll hold our own hearing. A gathering. Call in the old staff. The ones Carter pushed out. We bring the press. We bring the people. We let them speak." Marco looked uncertain. "Won't that just paint targets on all of us?" "Maybe," Ethan said, "but some truths don't survive silence. And this one's already bleeding." The morning sky was a wash of muted gray as Ethan pulled his coat tighter against the cold. The parking lot outside the old Golden Spoon East District branch was nearly empty. Except for a few delivery trucks and a row of cracked pavement where weeds had started to push through. It had once been a busy hub, humming with chatter and the clatter of kitchen trays. Now, it was quiet, forgotten. Inside, the air smelled like dust and disinfectant. The office lights flickered when Ethan, Lisa, and Marco stepped through the side entrance, which Lisa had unlocked using an old override code she still remembered from her days in field operations. The front counter was still intact, but the menus had been taken down, and the glass over the registers was smudged with time. "Jenny used to run this place," Marco said quietly, scanning the walls. They moved past the front area into the back office where Jenny once kept her files. Most of the drawers were empty now, either cleared during shutdown or scrubbed by corporate. But behind the file cabinet, Lisa noticed a tiny mark on the wall, an old sticker. Faded and torn, she pushed the cabinet aside with Ethan's help, revealing a wall safe tucked low behind the paneling. It took a few tries, but Lisa cracked the code using Jenny's old employee ID and her start date, something only someone who knew her would guess. Inside was a small leather-bound notebook, handwritten, tidy, each page dated, labeled with names and notes about meetings that had been deleted from digital logs. Employee warnings that were never officially issued. A pattern of retaliation for anyone who spoke up about inequity or mistreatment. "She kept everything," Lisa whispered. Ethan flipped to a page marked in red ink. It listed 5 names, employees who had filed internal complaints. All of them had been reassigned or quietly let go within weeks. As they were about to leave, a delivery truck rolled into the lot and idled near the loading dock. A tall man with a bushy beard and a limp stepped down from the cab. Whistling low, he spotted them through the office glass and gave a nod. "Hey there," he called softly as he approached the side entrance. "You folks looking for Jenny?" They exchanged glances. Ethan stepped forward. "You knew her?" The man nodded. "Name's Clarence. Used to stalk for her back in the day. I run warehouse routes now. But word travels." He leaned closer, voice lowering. "I heard she's being held at a place up north. Private wellness center. Supposed to be for mental rest. But folks say no one leaves without signing silence papers." Lisa looked up sharply. "You mean legal gag orders?" Clarence nodded slowly. "I heard Carter's got family on the board. It's all tied up in clean-looking paperwork. But something smells off." They thanked him and watched his truck pull away, disappearing into the morning mist. Back in the car, Ethan didn't say much. His hands stayed on the wheel, knuckles pale, eyes locked on the road. They were no longer just chasing company policy violations. Now, it was about control, about someone being silenced, possibly coerced. "We need help," he finally said. That evening, in a quiet corner of a coffee shop downtown, Ethan met with Natalie Rusk, a veteran investigative reporter known for her work on corporate discrimination in the food industry. She wore a turtleneck and denim jacket, hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge of fire behind it. "I've heard of Golden Spoon's expansion games," she said. "Didn't know it went this deep." Ethan slid Jenny's notes across the table. "We believe she's being held. And we need someone with reach, someone who can walk in and ask questions without setting off every alarm." Natalie studied the notebook. "You're not looking for discretion, are you?" "Not this time," Ethan said. "I need you to make noise when the time comes. But for now, we find Jenny." That night, Carter made his move. Ethan received a formal notice through internal legal counsel, thinly veiled as a compliance concern, accusing him of breaching information protocols and distributing internal data without clearance. The letter ended with a warning. Continued unauthorized actions may result in personal and legal consequences. Lisa read it over his shoulder. He's getting nervous, she muttered. That means we're close. Still, Ethan knew they had to be smart. He instructed Lisa and Natalie to operate independently for the next stretch. No emails, no office visits, just encrypted messages and burner numbers. Meanwhile, Ethan began preparing the next phase, an open hearing, scheduled to take place in a leased event hall. No formal golden spoon signage, just a quiet gathering call sent out to former employees, sympathetic branch managers, and a short list of trusted media outlets. It wouldn't be a company-sanctioned event, but it would be real. Late that night, as Ethan paced the office alone, his encrypted phone buzzed once. Lisa's message lit the screen. Confirmed. Jenny is alive, but she's in rough shape. We may not have much time. Ethan sat down slowly, the weight of the next move pressing on his chest. He had started this to fix a culture. But now it was about saving someone who risked everything to tell the truth. Ethan stood alone in his office, the soft glow of the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the desk. In his hands, he held a well-worn binder, his original Community First restructuring proposal. Crafted 5 years ago, the edges were frayed, some pages dog-eared from long nights and edits. He had once believed this plan would reshape the culture of Golden Spoon Diner into something better, something that mattered. He let out a breath, deep and quiet. The binder closed with a gentle snap. What he built was no longer in his hands alone. It was in the grip of men like Carter Voss. Men who saw people as numbers and compassion as weakness. While Ethan stayed behind preparing the next strike, Lisa and Natalie arrived at the private wellness center nestled on the outskirts of the northern suburbs. The building was modern, all glass and steel, surrounded by manicured lawns and silence. Too silent. Natalie adjusted her press badge and stepped forward first. Her voice was calm, rehearsed. We're doing a series on mental health recovery programs for frontline workers. We'd like to speak with the facility manager. The receptionist, a young man with a tight smile and blank eyes, nodded. Of course, let me check availability. Meanwhile, Lisa quietly wandered toward the east wing, pretending to take a call. She passed through a double set of frosted glass doors that led to the staff hallway, then disappeared around the corner. Natalie waited, keeping her camera case steady at her side. She wasn't here to interview anyone. She was here to expose a system. Moments later, while being ushered into a lounge for coffee, she slipped away during a staff shift change and ducked into a side corridor. Inside the residential quarters, the mood changed sharply. What had looked like wellness brochures at the front desk gave way to metal-locked doors. Beds spaced apart like a clinic, and patients who looked more confused than comforted. Natalie kept her camera low, capturing everything with brief, practiced movements. Lisa, further down the hall, found room 214. A laminated card hung from the door. Restricted visitation. She knocked once, twice. A weak but clear voice responded. Come in, quickly. Jenny sat upright in a thin cot, pale but alert. Her eyes lit up when she saw Lisa. They've cut off everything, she said quickly. No calls, no internet, no legal visits unless pre-approved by administration. Carter paid them to keep me here until the quarterly reports are finalized. He said if I spoke out, no one would believe me. Lisa's jaw clenched. She pressed Jenny's hand. You're not alone anymore. We're getting you out. Across the compound, Natalie's stealth didn't last. A red light blinked above the hallway. Security had spotted her through the internal monitoring system. A voice came through the intercom. Unauthorized personnel, please exit the premises immediately. Natalie backtracked calmly, keeping her footage safe. But the message was clear. They were being watched. As Lisa and Jenny exited through a service gate Natalie had propped open, a dark SUV parked across the street pulled away from the curb and began trailing them. It kept its distance at first. Then it got bolder, following for nearly 10 miles, weaving between cars and flashing headlights at sharp turns. Lisa finally pulled into a public gas station, where the car slowed down, then turned away. A warning, not an accident. Back at headquarters, Ethan didn't waste time. He drafted a discreet email addressed to the managers of 12 Eastern Region branches. requesting their presence at a leadership roundtable. The subject line was plain: service culture reflections, attendance encouraged. Nothing in the message hinted at the real purpose. In parallel, he called an old friend, Thomas Gray, a lawyer with decades of experience navigating corporate landmines. "I need everything ready," Ethan said, "if Carter retaliates through the legal system. I want to be 2 steps ahead. And I want our records airtight." "You're going to war, Ethan," Thomas said. "You sure you want to play this in public?" "I'm not the one who made it public," Ethan replied. "He did. I'm just putting a name to it." Meanwhile, Carter wasn't idle. He arranged a private meeting with Marianne Royce, the chair of the board. He slid a confidential report across her desk, outlining internal data leaks, employee misconduct, and alleged media manipulation. "Negative coverage is building," Carter warned. "If we don't neutralize the source, it'll spread." Marianne didn't respond right away. She tapped her pen gently on the report. "And do you know who's behind it?" Carter's lips twitched. "I have my suspicions." Moments later, Ethan arrived at the same office. He brought with him a sealed envelope containing photos, video stills, and transcriptions from Natalie and Lisa. The kind of file you don't email. The kind you deliver in person. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch. He simply said, "It's time the board saw what's happening under their own roof." As he turned to leave, his phone buzzed. Lisa's voice came through the encrypted line. "Jenny's out. We've got it all. Her voice, her face, and her full statement. She's willing to go public." Ethan stopped in the hallway, closed his eyes for a second, then opened them slowly. Across the glass wall, Carter stood near the elevators, phone to his ear, gaze cold and unreadable. Ethan murmured, almost to himself, "The board's about to flip. Carter, you just don't see it yet." The morning air was thick with tension as guests began to filter into the hall. The invitation had said, "Roundtable on Service Culture and Human Values." But those who came knew better. Folded between the lines was something louder, something unsaid, an invitation to truth. It was Ethan's doing, and word had traveled fast. Former employees, mid-level managers, current staffers, and even curious media personnel showed up, some standing at the back due to lack of seats. Carter wasn't there, not in person. Instead, a tight-lipped legal team occupied a front row table, along with 2 of his most loyal regional supervisors. Their expressions were unreadable. A few whispers moved between them, eyes flicking around the room. They weren't there to listen. They were there to contain. Ethan stood near the podium in a charcoal gray blazer. No tie. His hands rested calmly on either side of the lectern. The room hushed without being asked. "I want to tell you a story," he began, voice steady but warm. "Just a few days ago, I was standing in line like anyone else, waiting for a sandwich. 2 boys behind me were counting coins in their hands. One whispered, 'I've got $3. Do you think that's enough?' The other one said, 'Last time they wouldn't let me split a meal.'" He paused. "Those kids didn't make a fuss. They didn't beg. They just waited for us to pretend we didn't hear them." That moment, it stuck with me. He looked out at the room, scanning faces. What kind of company are we becoming when we turn away from children? From his jacket pocket, Ethan pulled out a small speaker, pressed a button. The voice that filled the room was unmistakably Carter's, collected, clinical. "Customers who don't contribute to our bottom line aren't our priority. We don't have the bandwidth to accommodate emotional liabilities." A few gasps, one sharp cough, and then silence. Ethan let the room breathe before continuing. "That wasn't a one-time thing. It was the new normal, set by someone who believes numbers matter more than people." He stepped aside as Leo Dunn walked to the front, dressed in a plain button-up. Leo looked like someone who'd spent years doing work no one applauded. "I ran a busy location near Easton," he said. "We had elderly customers who came not for food, but for warmth. Kids with empty pockets but hopeful eyes. I was told, clearly and repeatedly, to push them out gently, to discourage non-paying traffic. When I refused, I got demoted, then fired." Next, the screen behind the podium lit up. Jenny's recorded face appeared, tired, but defiant. "My name is Jenny Tran. I was held without cause in a wellness facility coordinated with Mr. Voss's office. No charges, no calls, just silence. I have the records, and I have my voice back now." Ethan nodded, and Marco took the floor. I used to be a scholarship student, he said. Ethan Marlowe funded that. I took a job at a local Golden Spoon to learn, to understand from the bottom up. And I saw how the mission he wrote down was being strangled by someone who didn't believe in it. People were told not to serve anyone who didn't look profitable. The room, once stiff with apprehension, had shifted. Managers from distant branches started murmuring, then raising hands. A woman from Newark stood. My team was told to remove the donation box for meal vouchers. We were told it made us look desperate. Another voice from the back. We had a veteran we comped lunch for every Friday. I was warned about showing favoritism. Then the legal representative stood abruptly. This meeting violates company policy on internal communications and unauthorized release of proprietary data. I must formally object on behalf of Mr. Voss. But before the tension could spiral, Natalie stood. Actually, she said, pulling a tablet from her bag, we've just published a live investigation, video footage from a so-called wellness center, where Golden Spoon staff were being detained under false medical pretenses. It's already spreading across social media. And within minutes, national news will pick it up. The screen behind her changed. The article appeared, headline in bold. Inside the silence, how a national food chain quietly isolated its whistleblowers. Gasps, murmurs, some hands covered mouths. The weight in the room had shifted. For the first time, it tilted against Carter. Then a man near the aisle stood up. Middle-aged, denim jacket, calloused hands. He cleared his throat. I'm the father of one of those boys Mr. Marlowe mentioned. My son came home that day hungry. But what stuck with me is that someone finally noticed. Mr. Marlowe didn't turn his back. Thank you. The room fell silent. Ethan stepped forward one last time. I didn't organize this to ruin a career. I did this to remind us of who we were before margins replaced meaning. We can rebuild this, but not with silence, not with fear. He looked toward the cameras. Voice unwavering. A company without a heart is just paperwork and payroll. And I will defend our heart, no matter what it costs me. By mid-morning, the digital storm had swept across the internet like a wildfire. Natalie's report, complete with voice clips, grainy footage from inside the so-called care facility, and testimonials from former employees, was everywhere. Hashtags flooded the feed. Golden Spoon scandal. Justice for Jenny. Serve with heart. Customers posted stories of poor treatment. Local news picked it up by noon. Cable news followed by dinner time. Inside the sleek marble halls of Golden Spoon's headquarters, the atmosphere was anything but calm. The emergency board meeting had been called just before dawn. No press, no assistants, just the 12 board members. Marianne Royce at the head of the table, and 2 seats waiting, one for Carter Voss, the other for Ethan Marlowe. Carter arrived with polished calm. He wore a tailored navy suit, expression unreadable but eyes sharp as razors. His briefcase clicked open on the table with mechanical precision. Ethan followed moments later. No briefcase, no entourage, just a folder under his arm and a quiet determination in his step. Marianne cleared her throat. We're here to address the breach of protocol, the content of the report, and the damage this situation may cause if not managed swiftly and clearly. Carter wasted no time. With all due respect, this is a calculated ambush, he said, voice steady. The footage was illegally obtained. The employee in question, Ms. Tran, was under investigation for misconduct before she was transferred to a wellness partner. Mr. Marlowe has taken unilateral actions, including unauthorized access to private servers, in violation of board policies and federal data laws. He passed out printed copies of financial projections. And these so-called humanitarian programs? Look at the numbers. They drag profit margins. They dilute brand identity. We're not a charity, we're a business. Ethan didn't flinch. He simply stood and opened his folder. I admit I broke protocol, he said plainly. I accessed internal systems without prior clearance. But I did it because people were getting hurt while we looked the other way. And because, frankly, I didn't trust that those tasked with oversight would act if I filed a formal complaint. He set down a tablet, played a clip. Carter's voice filled the room again. Don't call it detainment, call it containment. We're just keeping loud mouths from causing more damage. There was a silence that lingered a little too long. Then Carter countered with his own blow. May I remind the board that 5 years ago, Mr. Marlowe himself signed a delegation agreement granting full operational autonomy to regional executives. Including me? He slid the document down the table. Ethan's signature was clear at the bottom. You gave us the keys, Ethan, and now you want to blame the drivers for the destination. Ethan felt the weight of the paper more than its words. He had signed that, back when expansion was the obsession and his calendar was too full to watch every store's heartbeat. Maybe that was when it started slipping. I trusted my people, Ethan said softly. That trust was not a blank check to erase compassion from our business. Delegating authority is not the same as endorsing cruelty. The board murmured. 2 members shifted in their chairs. Another removed her glasses, wiped them clean without speaking. The lines were forming, not along loyalty, but fear of headlines, lawsuits, falling shares. Mary Ann tapped a pen against the table. Mr. Marlowe, she said, if you were to propose a solution, one that protects the brand but also addresses these ethical failures, what would it look like? Ethan drew a breath. We launch a program called Shared Table, he said, a partnership between Golden Spoon and local nonprofits. We serve 1 free meal per location per day to someone in need. Every store, every day, we share their stories, show our people what it means to serve again. It's not just a good deed, it's good business. Transparency, humanity, a brand with a backbone. Mary Ann leaned back in her chair, folded her arms. Sounds like a good beginning, she said, but a beginning isn't enough. We need closure. Just then, the door opened. Natalie walked in, escorted by a security guard. In her hand was a thick envelope. Apologies for the interruption, she said. This was sent to me anonymously after the article went live. She handed it to Mary Ann, who opened it carefully. Inside were photocopies of wire transfers, dozens of them, bank statements, a forged budget breakdown, all tied to the employee training fund Carter had overseen for the past 3 years. Funds had been diverted, some sent to shell companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. Mary Ann didn't speak for a long moment. Then she looked up. Mr. Voss, she said, her voice firm but even. We'll need to speak with legal counsel. Immediately. The room was silent except for the soft rustle of paper as Natalie placed the envelope in front of Chairwoman Mary Ann Royce. No one spoke. Mary Ann's fingers moved with controlled precision as she pulled out the documents, financial ledgers, scanned memos, routing numbers, and a spreadsheet annotated in a handwriting few could forget. She didn't look at Carter as she read. She didn't have to. The stillness said more than words. After 2 minutes, she looked up. This meeting is suspended pending immediate verification of the material provided, she said quietly. An independent audit team will be assembled tonight. The board members stood without a word. No motion was called, no votes taken, just a quiet understanding that something had ruptured far deeper than they'd prepared for. By sunrise, whispers had become headlines. Golden Spoon rocked by high-level misconduct. Alleged financial tampering under federal review. Anonymous sources confirm ethics probe underway. The next day, office chatter buzzed like a restless hive. Young employees in the break room pulled up articles on their phones. A regional supervisor canceled a morning meeting just to replay the segment where Jenny's voice cracked while describing her days in confinement. Ethan's name began to trend, not as a suspect, but as the man who had cracked open a silent wall. His inbox filled with emails from former employees, store managers, and even customers. Some short, just a line or two. Others long, heart-wrenching stories about the things they'd seen and stayed quiet about. Until now, Carter Voss, for his part, moved swiftly. He summoned his private legal team to headquarters and filed a formal resignation. But he didn't leave quietly. A letter sent to the board claimed breach of contract, reputational damage, and unlawful surveillance. He offered what he called a dignified exit. He would step down and fade from the spotlight, provided the company agreed not to press charges or publicly release the audit findings. He asked to retain a portion of his shares. Ethan's response was immediate and without hesitation. There's no room for silence when justice demands a voice, he said during the emergency session. This isn't about revenge, it's about integrity, and we owe that to every person this system failed. Silence again, and then something shifted. A board member who had previously supported Carter, a man named Robert Wells. Quiet, sharp, often neutral, spoke. "I was wrong," he said. "I believed stability mattered more than transparency. But what I've seen in these last 48 hours, that was a lie I told myself. We can't make peace with corruption." His words tipped the scale. The board voted, this time with no dissent. Carter's resignation was accepted, but the legal immunity he'd requested was denied. The findings would be referred to federal investigators, with full cooperation from the company. Later that evening, in a small side room just off the lobby, Natalie found Ethan reviewing the official press release. She smiled as she slipped him a small thumb drive. "The whistleblower," she said. "Turns out Carter's former assistant had copies of the same records. She told me. He thought I was invisible. Turns out I was just waiting for someone to see me." Ethan held the drive in his palm for a moment, then placed it inside his jacket. By the following week, Carter's name had vanished from the Golden Spoon website. A new statement took its place, an announcement of the Shared Table Initiative. A pledge to provide one free, healthy meal each week to children from low-income households, with local partnerships and community events to foster connection. The first launch day came on a clear Friday morning. Staff wore new aprons with stitched hearts on the chest. Smiles, not fake ones, but real, easy ones, filled the air like music. Ethan didn't stand at the podium. He didn't speak to the cameras. Instead, he lingered near the kitchen entrance, watching the youngest servers assemble small trays, pour milk cartons, and laugh when the bread baskets ran out faster than expected. Lisa found him leaning against a column, arms crossed, eyes soft. "Do you think the system's really changed?" she asked. He watched a little girl grin as a server handed her a tray. "Not yet," he said, "but today, at least it listened." For the first time in years, Ethan Marlowe had no meetings on his calendar, no emails flooding his inbox, no back-to-back calls waiting on hold. The chaos that had consumed Golden Spoon in the past weeks had now eased into a watchful stillness. And in that stillness, Ethan stepped back. He handed over the interim reins to Lisa Park. It wasn't a formal ceremony, just a quiet conversation in his office. A handwritten note with his login credentials. And a simple sentence, "You've already been leading," he said. "Now it's just official." Then he packed a weekend bag and drove north, far from the company headquarters, back to the old cabin where he'd spent his boyhood. The place hadn't changed much. The wood creaked in all the same places. The windows still fogged over when he boiled water for tea. But his heart felt different now. He wasn't the kid who used to stare out at the snow-covered trees and dream of running something big. He was the man who'd done it, and had nearly let it slip into something he didn't recognize. The days passed slowly. Ethan spent hours at the small desk by the window, sorting through letters he'd received from former employees and frontline workers. Some were typed, some scribbled in pen or pencil, some written with more emotion than grammar. They spoke of exhaustion, small victories, moments of doubt, and occasional glimpses of hope. And threaded through them all was one recurring phrase: "I stayed because I believed." Ethan thought about that, what it meant to believe in something enough to stay. Even when the system forgot you. Even when leadership turned away. At night, he reread old feedback reports that had been buried for years. Complaints dismissed as minor. Praise never acknowledged. People who had spoken up and paid for it in silence. It was hard not to feel the weight of all he'd missed. One morning, as a soft snow began to fall, a small envelope arrived in his cabin mailbox. No return address, just his name in messy, slanted writing. Inside was a folded piece of notebook paper. On it, in crayon, was a drawing of a smiling man in a suit, standing beside two kids at a diner table. Above it were the words, "Thank you for not walking away. We get to sit every week now and people smile when we come in." Ethan stared at the picture for a long time. Then slowly, he folded the paper and pressed it to his chest. The tears came not with a dramatic heave, but quietly, steadily. It wasn't the victory that moved him. It was that something so simple, his silence that day in line. His decision not to speak right away had grown into something bigger than policy or boardroom votes. It had become belonging. Later that week, Natalie Rusk showed up at the cabin. She didn't call ahead. She just knocked on the door with a thermos of coffee in hand and a look that said she needed to talk, not as a journalist, but as someone who'd walked through the storm too. They sat by the fireplace, mugs in hand, words slow and thoughtful. "You know," Natalie said, "for a while I thought journalism had lost its way. Too loud, too shallow, too quick to move on. But watching all of this unfold, seeing what your people risked, I started believing again. Justice doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes it just needs to show up." Ethan nodded slowly. "Justice doesn't have to win every time," he said. "It just can't be forgotten." They didn't say much after that. The fire crackled. Outside, the snowfall deepened, covering the porch steps and the footprints that led to them. The next morning, a call came through from Marianne. "I'm not calling about numbers or board meetings," she said. "I just wanted to let you know. Several other restaurant groups have reached out. They're asking about the shared table program. They want to try it too." Ethan looked out the window. The sunlight had started to break through the clouds, laying soft streaks of gold across the snow. "Maybe," he said quietly, "it's time for me to come back. Not to run things, not to manage numbers, but to protect the soul of what we built. That, I still believe in." The air inside the Golden Spoon headquarters in Boston carried a sense of cautious renewal. The lobby buzzed with the hum of voices, some familiar, some new, for the first time since the scandal had cracked the foundation of the company. The entire team, regional directors, store managers, returning staff, and newly hired trainees, gathered under one roof. But the tone was different now. Gone were the rigid agendas and scripted speeches of years past. In their place was a collective pause. Like everyone had shown up not just to talk, but to listen. Ethan Marlowe didn't wear a suit. He stood at the back of the auditorium until someone noticed him and whispered his name. The room quieted naturally, not from protocol, but from respect. When he finally made his way to the small wooden podium, he didn't clear his throat or wait for applause. He just looked at the crowd and said, "I'm not here to lead. I'm here to listen." He didn't linger. After a few more words, he stepped aside and took a seat near the edge of the stage. Lisa Park stepped up next. The crowd knew her story by now, how she'd once been the only voice raising quiet questions in boardrooms that didn't want to hear them. Now, with the full weight of the organization behind her, she announced the new training initiative, no longer just about efficiency or sales targets. It would be grounded in emotional intelligence, active listening, and real-world compassion. "We'll still teach people how to take orders," she said, "but first, we'll teach them how to see the person in front of them." When Marco took the stage, the energy shifted. He wasn't polished. He didn't have management experience or corporate accolades. But he had something else, lived experience. "I used to be invisible," he began. "Now I'm here to help us see each other." He introduced the framework of the new shared table program, which would provide weekly meals to children and families in need. But more than that, it would create welcoming environments where those same families could feel like they belonged, not just tolerated. Not just helped, but welcomed. The audience clapped, some even stood. But amid the hopeful air, a hand raised from the back of the room. A board member, one of the older ones who had stayed mostly silent through the recent storms, asked the question out loud that had likely lived in the minds of many. "What makes you think this system won't fall back into the same cracks it did before?" The room went still. All eyes turned to Ethan. He stood slowly, not walking back to the podium but staying where he was. "I don't," he said. "Every system has cracks. Every one. But this time, the cracks will be visible. Because now, this system has people who know what they look like, and who won't ignore them when they show up." He didn't need to say more. The room absorbed it. Later, Natalie Rusk stepped to the front, remote in hand, and dimmed the lights. What followed was a short documentary-style video that traced the journey from the moment Ethan overheard two boys whispering about lunch money to the night of the public hearing. It was not dramatized. It didn't need to be. The truth had carried enough weight on its own. The final scene showed the two boys, now dressed neatly, smiling shyly, as they entered a Golden Spoon location. A host greeted them by name and led them to a booth already set for two. The room filled with the soft hush of breath held back and released. When the lights returned, everyone stood. The applause wasn't loud, it was deep. It came from somewhere beyond duty or celebration. It came from recognition. Ethan didn't move toward the front again. Instead, he stepped back, reaching up to touch the wooden placard newly installed above the stage. Its lettering was simple: serve from the heart, not from the spreadsheet. He ran his hand over the wood like it was the back of an old friend. Then he turned and walked out quietly through the side hallway. Back in Lisa's office, the applause still echoing through the walls, she noticed an envelope on her desk. The return address was handwritten, from a competing restaurant group on the West Coast. Inside was a letter that read, "We'd like to learn about your shared table model. Would Mr. Marlowe be open to a conversation?" Lisa looked out the window and saw Ethan in the courtyard below, speaking gently with a new recruit holding a tray of coffee. She smiled, folded the letter, and tucked it into her notebook. Then she walked to the door, opened it, and nodded. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a CEO fixing what was broken. It was a reminder that systems don't fail overnight, they fail in silence. And sometimes, all it takes to begin change is one person who chooses to listen instead of look away. What would you do if you had the power to make just one moment feel human again? If this story moved you, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to Undercover Truths for more real stories that reveal what truly matters beneath the surface.